day, my wonderful and successful international students. I am very happy to be back. And today we have a very interesting topic. Today we're going to be talking about the International Student Guide to Formality. And I'm going to start with some examples that are probably going to resonate with many of you. First of all, here in Canada, it is very common for me to have students from countries in which addressing instructors, teachers, and professors with a very high level of respect is usually very common. Therefore, I have students that usually from class one address me as Madam or Mrs. Sandoval, Miss Sandoval. And of course, on day one, we usually show them, teach them, share with them that here in Canada, it's very common to address professors and instructors on a first name basis, because that's actually what they are going to be experiencing once they start working here in Canada. So that is a situation we go through. It's very, very common. And I am sure you have probably seen something that may be similar to this situation. Now, I'm going to give you another example. I was sharing with my students last Saturday that the first time I went to Colombia for business, I was very young. I was 28 years old. It was my first international trip. And in Mexico, I'm going to explain a little bit about the Spanish part. I don't know if you know, in Mexico, in Spanish, just like in French, we have two ways to address people, right? We have one way to address people, which is very formal, which is usted, which means you. And we have a more informal way to address someone, which is tú, which is also you, but in a very informal way. So usually in Mexico, it is very common for us just to talk to each other in a very informal way, using you, of course. And what first confused me a lot when I arrived at the airport in Bogota, in Colombia, was that everybody was addressing me not only as usted, which is very formal, but they were also calling me señora, which means madam. But in Mexico, it's actually rude to call madam somebody who's still young. You call madam usually someone who is married, someone who is maybe about 40, 50 years old. And I remember when I arrived at the hotel, I felt so old. I couldn't believe, like, why are they calling me madam? Like, do I really look that old? Because of course, this was my first experience in a country in which addressing someone, even if you were very young, addressing someone with a very formal way, that was my first experience. So it was very confusing. Now I'm laughing, but right there, you can imagine, I wasn't laughing. I was worried. Maybe I look very, 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 very old. And and on Saturday also, one of my students, Carlos, if you're watching this, you're going to remember, you shared in the class that you had met some colleagues at work that were from Eastern Europe, and that they were too direct. And you actually shared that you felt that they were being rude because you, Carlos, are from Colombia. And like me, in Latin American countries, usually we are not that direct, right? And finally, you can also imagine that most people that usually get to know people from Mexico, from other countries in Latin America, sometimes were perceived as hypocritical. And I'm here to tell you, we're not hypocritical. We're just used to maybe going around the bushes. We don't like to say things directly. And we like maybe to save face, as we say it. And that's just the way things are. So today's episode is exactly about that. It's about how all these situations and examples are classic clashes of the power, distance, cultural dimension. And for all of you who have been my students, of course, you have heard about this before. I always talk about this theory in my classes, Hofstede, Dutch. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, because Hofstede was a psychologist who developed a theory in which he explained that different cultures are going to have different values. And these different values, of course, are going to impact the way we behave in that culture. Now, how and why is this important for international students? Well, because we're going from one culture into another culture, and now we're immersed in a culture that is completely different most of the times to the cultures where we were born. So this is why the culture shock is usually so big for a lot of international students. So today we're going to explain very briefly three theories, okay, to understand where this is coming from. And I'm going to talk about Hofstede, of course, the power distance theory. Then I'm going to talk about how Trompenaars, another scientist, who he talked about the difference between achievement and instruction, and we're going to talk about that too. And then finally, another scientist who he talked about high context and low context communication. So very briefly, we're going to talk about those three. And at the end, I'm going to give you the three ideas, three strategies that you can put in place right away to try to make sure that you are getting the right level of formality once you arrive into your new country. Okay, very good. So let's begin with the first one. High power distance and low power distance. What is this? Well, Hofstede developed a theory, as I already mentioned, in which he said, okay, cultures are different. Cultures that are or have a high power distance are cultures in which usually everything, the hierarchy is very important in companies. And right here, you can see in this image that in countries in which you have a high hierarchy, usually whatever the boss says, that's what we do. And usually employees are never going to question what the boss says, correct? However, in low power cultures, just like Canada, for example, Australia or the USA, usually companies have a flat organization. And in these flat organizations in which they have low power distance, there are usually organizations, companies in which you are expected to actually debate with your professors. You're actually expected to give feedback to your boss. You're actually expected to question some of the suggestions or strategies that are maybe being put by the team, etc. But why is this so challenging then? And why is this interesting for us international students? Because if you come from a high power distance in which you're used to calling everyone professor, Mrs., etc., well, when you arrive into a country that may be low power, you might seem disengaged. You might seem like, wait a minute, why is this person not participating in the discussion? And I see this in my classrooms at Vancouver Community College every single week. Now, of course, I understand that my students are coming from different cultures, so I do not take their lack of participation in the class as, I don't know, they don't care. No, of course they care, but they're just learning how to engage in debates and class participations, maybe coming from countries where nobody has ever asked them, what's your opinion? What do you think? And that's why it's so challenging for some students. So again, the high power distance, low power distance cultures, it's important for us to understand because, again, if you're coming from a low power culture into a high power distance, you may actually seem rude if you talk to your professor on a first name basis, right? They're going to think like, wait a minute, what is going on here? And I'm going to give you an example. When I was doing my master's degree in education back in Mexico, we had a student who came from the US to study the master's degree in Mexico with us. And the first time we met with our professor, the director for the master's degree, I remember he called her, "Hi, Liliana, how are you doing?" Oh my dear God, you have no idea. She got so angry and in front of everyone, and this was really, really sad. She immediately said, "Excuse me, I am not your friend and I'm not like your buddy or anything. I am Professor Soberon and you better call me Dr. Soberon." So I know it was really, really embarrassing. And that's why this is one of the reasons why I'm making this video, because I believe we international students should know about this before we arrive into our new country. Sometimes nobody tells us, nobody is telling us about all these hidden truths. Remember the hidden curriculum, what nobody tells us. Well, this is it, guys. And that's why it's so important to understand that difference. Now, the next theory, which is it's easier, Trumpreneurs, it's about achievement and ascription. The only difference here is that in countries in which ascription is important, that means that you are going to be more powerful, or you're going to usually have more hierarchy just because you are an older person, just because you are the boss, maybe, just because you have a title that is important, and your title is very important. Some high power distance cultures, for example, in entrepreneurs' achievement and ascription, are Mexico, China, India, and some of the Arab countries. Just like I told you the example with Dr. Soberon, she wanted to be called doctor, right? So why? Because her title is very important, and people expect those titles to be respected and recognized. Okay, now let's go with the opposite. Low power distance countries or cultures in achievement and ascription are Canada, Australia, and USA. And in these countries, equality is usually what you're going to see mostly in schools and universities, and also when you start working. Usually, you're expected to call everyone on a first name basis. And as I already mentioned, you're expected to share your ideas. Now, here, the power goes to achievement. Whatever you achieve, that's the person who usually receives more recognition and more formality. Let me give you an example, okay? Because otherwise this theory is not so easy to understand. When you are working in a team, because that's going to be very common as an international student, you're going to have team assignments. Very good. Okay. Usually, when you're working in a team, when you work with people who are coming from high power distance, usually cultures, the older member of the team is usually the one expected to start organizing the team, the one actually becoming the leader. Everyone expects the older student to become the leader of the team, or at least the one starting to say, okay, organizing everything, how are we going to work? Usually everyone expects the older student to be that person. However, if you have in your team classmates, international students that are coming from low powered distance cultures or countries in which is through achievement, okay, the level of formality that they obtain, usually it doesn't matter if he or she is the youngest person in the team. If he or she may have the knowledge, that person may take control and be the leader of the team. So why is this important to understand? Because sometimes we have confusions or we have misunderstandings with our team members. And it's really difficult because you're going to be working in teams with people from different countries and different cultures. So understanding achievement and ascription cultures is going to help you understand that nobody's trying to be rude. Nobody's trying to control, to take control. Nobody's trying. It's just the way we were raised, the way we usually see natural things happening around us in our cultures. So my invitation again, always, every time I talk to you in the videos and in my classes, you can of course research a little bit more about this theory. Now, the last theory I'm going to talk about, it's Hall's. Now, Hall talks about high context and low context communication. And it's a little bit similar to the previous one, but I'm going to give you some examples. Now, usually, when you come from high context cultures, which are, for example, Latin American cultures, Korea and Japan, communication is not direct. Usually, we go around the bushes. We don't like to say things as they are because we want to keep harmony. And we don't want to be embarrassed to say we don't agree or we don't think that's a good idea. We're going to say sometimes, so are we going to be meeting next week? Yes, of course. Yes, we'll be meeting next week. But that's maybe we are not really willing to be there next week, but we don't want to say no because that will seem rude. In some cultures, this is normal. But there are other cultures in which it's absolutely the opposite. Cultures, for example, in countries like Germany, Switzerland, or the Netherlands, people are direct. And if they tell you, you know what, I disagree with you, that's just what they're trying to say. They're not being rude. That's just the way they communicate. Now, why is this so important too? And I always give my students this example and everybody laughs. Mr. Jenkins, my life partner, as you know, he's from England. So you can imagine, right? The Mexican and the British, yeah, I know, very, this theory, I know, Hall will be very happy with our story. I always tell my students, and I was just talking to Mr. Jenkins, remembering this situation. The first time I cooked for him, I fixed his plate, right? So he wasn't at the table. I give him his plate and I tell him, honey, start eating before your food gets cold. Okay, fine. I turn back, I go back to the kitchen. And while I fix my plate, it took some time. When I finally am ready and I sit down, he had already finished eating his food. And I almost started crying because I thought, why didn't he wait for me? Of course, I know you're laughing now because he was laughing just a few hours ago when we were talking about this. And he said, you told me eat before it gets cold. So that's what I did. But that's because he comes from a low context culture in which people say what they mean. They don't say other words. And I come from Mexico, of course, a high context culture in which we don't mean it. We're just trying to be nice, right? And I know many of you are probably laughing. Please share your stories in the comments. I know you have stories like this. I know many of you, my former students, you have been through situations like this. So please share in the comments because your experiences are going to help other international students. Now, the action plan, finally, 3 ideas. The first action plan, the first idea is you're going to become a cultural detective. And what you're going to be doing is observe, mirror, and do your research before you travel. This number 1 strategy is key because even though these theories I was sharing are, of course, based in scientific knowledge and a lot of research, we cannot generalize a whole culture, right? Because I was also talking to Mr. Jenkins earlier today. Even in England, we have different levels of formality. In the South, people are less formal. In the north of England, people are more formal. The same happens in Mexico. We have states in which people tend to be more formal and places in which people tend to be less formal. So my suggestion is do your research. Try to research what people usually talk like, speak like, try to watch videos, tutorials like this, etc. Try to read articles. That's going to help you. And once you arrive, first watch, observe. How do people talk to other people? How do people address other people? That's strategy number 1. The strategy number 2, of course, might seem very obvious, but sometimes we don't do it. Ask the preference question, meaning the respectful clarifier, just to make sure when you arrive to your school and you're meeting your professors, you're meeting your boss, ask respectfully. Hi, I just got here. I just would like to confirm how you would like to be, how should I address you? Should I address you as Mrs., Mr., Doctor? Yes, or by first name. And usually that's the best way to go because usually the person will tell you, like me, I always tell them, call me Ada, call me Ada. Okay. And still, I know it is hard and challenging for many of my students to get used to calling me Ada when they have never addressed a professor in their lives by first name. Now, of course, asking this question is going to help. If you cannot ask the question, imitate what other international students, what other students usually do. Okay. And the last strategy that I have for you, adapt your communication style. And this is the flexible navigator. Even in low culture or high culture, high level cultures, you still may have to adapt your level of communication. All right. It's not the same, even if you're in Canada, in the US, you may still come out as too informal in many circumstances or situations. So always my suggestion, try to be adaptive. Try to be a person who's going to be flexible. When you have a job, if you're going to find a job, if you're also starting to work, ask other people, how should we address our manager? Are we allowed to talk to our manager directly? How do we do things here? So usually my suggestions are going to be do it. Do it, and hopefully ask other people, try to imitate, do your research, and I am sure my wonderful and successful international students, unfortunately, the trial error, sometimes it's what works. I hope you don't have a lot of failures like the ones I had. I hope that you are successful. And do not forget, if you have your own experiences, please share in the comments, because I am sure that many of your own stories are going to help other international students in the future. And finally, remember, it's not only about studying abroad, it's about thriving abroad, okay? You've got this. You know I believe in you, and I will see you in our next episode. Ciao.